Okay, so tonight's speaker, we have Nigel. Now, Nigel is actually one of our members and he comes onto the meetings, our Brisbane branch meetings, so it's lovely to have one of our attendees actually be a speaker tonight. He has spoken in the branch before, but it's been a few years now, so it's lovely to have a bit of an update from him. Now, Nigel graduated in 1977 from ANU with an arts degree and majoring in philosophy and law. He was invited to do further study in philosophy, but decided instead on a career in information technology. After many years as a mainframe software developer, he has recently embraced newer technology and is currently writing a smartphone app. Nigel first read the works of Ayn Rand 41 years ago, and they've continued to inspire and educate him ever since. Thank you, Nigel, for coming and speaking at the branch tonight. Excited to hear what you have to say. Over to you.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, the title of the talk tonight is Why Ayn Rand's Philosophy is Critical to Liberty. And by liberty, I mean laissez-faire capitalism, which is defined as the social system in which all property is privately owned and in which the rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness are protected. Way too many years ago, I was growing up in Canberra. I went to school at a Church of England private school. We attended chapel on Wednesdays. We had the scripture lessons. My reading at this time included a lot of Charles Dickens, who was understandably very concerned with the widespread poverty in mid-19th century London. And this had quite an impact on me. I then went on to the ANU after school to do politics, philosophy, and Asian civilizations and law. From all of this, I ended up with the idea that the ideal life was one lived in service to others. From my earliest days, I'd heard from my parents and in chapel and from my teachers and from the books I read, don't be selfish, look after the needy. Looking back, I probably would have ended up as a woke bureaucrat, busily administering the myriad regulations of our paternalistic, freedom-loving government, freedom-destroying government. But fortunately, I met a beautiful girl and she lived in Sydney. So off to Sydney I went and I got a job in a white goods retailer in the head office, Norman Ross. Now, after the ideas that I'd absorbed up till then, I didn't find working for a retailer fulfilling. I suspect that that was because I saw it as a commercial enterprise, guided only by the selfish profit motive. So I had it pretty bad. Now, if you'd asked me at that point what I thought of a party which wants to reduce welfare substantially and even to remove it, I would have been absolutely appalled. My reaction would have been, how can you even think like this? How can you be so immoral? Now, fortunately, not long after this, the beautiful girl introduced me to Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead. For those of you not familiar with Ayn Rand, she was born in Russia in 1905. She witnessed the Bolshevik Revolution and also under that, or later, the confiscation of her family's pharmacy. She lived for 8 years under communism, but managed to leave in 1926 at the age of 21, and she went to America. And over the course of the next few decades, she wrote screenplays, a novelette, and 3 novels. The first one was the fulfillment of a promise she'd made to or to tell the world about Russia under communism. And that was We the Living, published in 1936. The next one, The Fountainhead, published in 1943, was a novel about an architect of great integrity. And Atlas Shrugged was published in 1957. It tells the story of great producers who are suffering, really, and then ultimately reacting to the ever-growing regulatory state. A central character is Hank Rearden. He's risen from mine labourer to steel manufacturer. And in the last 10 years in his spare time, he's devoted this time to work through frustration after frustration, failure after failure, to invent a metal superior to steel. And he's finally done this. And then, of course, the government goes to work on him, as you can imagine. After Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand wrote non-fiction articles. She published periodicals, current affairs, philosophical periodicals, and many of her essays were published as works of non-fiction. The Virtue of Selfishness, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, The New Left, the Anti-Industrial Revolution, and a very technical piece on epistemology, an introduction to objectivist epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge and how we acquire it. After my 3 years of philosophy at uni, I was hugely impressed with how integrated and how rational her philosophy was and is. Ayn Rand has been very influential. Her books still sell at the rate of a few 100,000 a year. And in fact, in 2009, in the GFC, Atlas Shrugged sold 500,000 copies. The combined sales of her books during that year were 1 million. A novel, The Fountainhead, was made into a film starring Gary Cooper. And there was a stamp issued, a US postal stamp commemorating her. Many prominent entrepreneurs have been influenced by her. For example, Jimmy Wales, co-founder of Wikipedia, said of her philosophy, Objectivism, it colours everything I do and think. I know of several on Australia's rich list who've been influenced by her ideas and inspired by her. In terms of academia, in America, there are several objectivist philosophies teaching at universities. And here's a quote from philosopher Dr. Harry Binswanger, who lectured in philosophy at the City University of New York. About her achievements in philosophy, he said, in future ages, historians will teach that the science of philosophy began with Plato, was set on the right foundation by Aristotle, and after a long period of stagnation and darkness, was built into a towering edifice by Ayn Rand. So back to my job at the white goods retailer, what explained my very low opinion of the profit motive? The ethical theory I'd absorbed from parents, books, teachers, and the pulpit was altruism. Now, altruism is not benevolence or goodwill or helping others because they're in trouble through no fault of their own. It's an ethical theory advanced by the very influential 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. It teaches that your moral duty is to sacrifice for the needy. You haven't the right just to live for yourself. Selfish is bad, selflessness and sacrifice are good. And by selfish, I mean they're the original definition in one's own interests. Altruism is not donating to the bushfire victims or to fund a search for a cancer cure. or to help those consigned to unemployment by the lockdown. Altruism is not giving money you can afford to those hit by catastrophe. It's the Australian philosopher Peter Singer saying that Bill Gates may have given away nearly $30 billion, but he still lives on a $100 million estate. And he owns the Leicester Codex, Leonardo da Vinci's handwritten notebook, for which he paid $30.8 million in 1994. Singer asks, aren't there more lives he could save? It's the American Zell Kravinsky saying who gave away most of his real estate fortune of $45 million and then decided he should donate a kidney to a stranger. His wife wasn't happy at all. She said, what if our children need it? And later on he said, why are our children more important than anyone else's? So that's altruism. It will be selfish to value his children more than anyone else's. But even worse, he was honored in a resolution of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, which described him as a shining example of humanity and a beacon of compassion. So what examples do we see in Australia? Well, recently the calls to sacrifice for the vulnerable in the COVID-19 crisis and the readiness to accept these calls, even though the vast majority will only have mild symptoms. If you've invested years of your life into building your dream business and can think of a way of keeping it open safely, never mind, there will be other business owners who might behave irresponsibly. So you must sacrifice. If you want your children to see your aged parents, and you can think of a way of doing that safely. Or if you want to go fishing to relieve your stress and misery from losing your job, your business, in fact, never mind, you must give it up for the good of the community. If you don't, you'll lead others to drive around endangering the community. The default position of some Labor leaders seems to be that if it's not causing enough unhappiness, then we're not sacrificing enough. It doesn't matter what we have to do or we want to do has a minimal risk of causing anyone harm. You still got to sacrifice. So you must give up your selfish desire to sit on a park bench with your girlfriend or your boyfriend. And the initial treatment of landlords during the crisis, they don't count because if they have properties to let, they must be selfish and wealthy. And before the virus, there was sacrifice for climate. Sacrifice urged for those frightened by the prospect of climate change. Sacrifice for our jobs and living standards and the rights of farmers to clear their land. Sacrifice for future generations and to set a moral example. This was certainly a sacrifice since there would be no benefit from cutting our insignificant emissions. And more generally in business, the idea that business ethics is an oxymoron, since anything to do with business and the profit motive is selfish and therefore immediately disqualified from ethics. The desire for woke executives to soften business by supporting charitable causes. And of course, any attempts to cut welfare are met by accusations of being selfish and callous. And you've got the requirement for community service in schools. This is seen as more important for the students than the crucial task of gaining knowledge and deciding on a career. So what political system does altruism lead to? Most people believe that governments should compel people to do their moral duty and to hand over their money to those in need. As Pope John VI said, you're not making a gift of your possessions to the poor person. You are handing over to him what is his. So if you have a moral obligation to help the needy, then they have a corresponding right to food, to shelter, and whatever else they see as important needs. Logically, then, if people are not forced to hand over to the needy, the so-called rights of the needy are being violated. It's therefore no surprise that altruism leads to statism, as we've seen with communism and Nazism and the huge growth of the welfare state. Why is this specifically? It's because politics depends on ethics. Like ethics, politics is a normative branch of philosophy. It is concerned with what principles should guide social organization. Therefore, it depends on the identification of a standard of value to determine what is good for us and what is bad. And because the only ethics that people have heard are the ethics of self-sacrifice, this is what guides them in politics. Altruism also influences people to close their eyes to the great benefits of capitalism. Capitalism is bad, they say. It encourages the selfish profit motive. Case closed. So up to now, I've given you the problem as I see it. Altruism is still widespread. It's not going away of its own accord, and it leads to statism. Sorry, talk not over yet. I need to give you Ayn Rand's solution. So what did I get from Ayn Rand that helped me reevaluate capitalism and the profit motive? Firstly, the principled entrepreneur as a moral, even heroic figure. It was clear how much Hank Rearden deserved the rewards for his creativity and his dedication. Secondly, that it was possible to ground morality in facts, to formulate a universal code of values that was objectively applicable to everyone. Now, this is contrary to centuries of philosophy. And we don't have time for me to really explain this, but let me give you a quick overview of Ayn Rand's approach. She took a completely fresh approach to morality. She asked, what is it about life or reality that gives rise to the need for morality and values? She identified that living things need to pursue values to sustain their lives. But what about morality? Ayn Rand defined morality as a code of fundamental values accepted by choice. We are conceptual beings. We live by reason, by observing reality and acquiring knowledge and deciding on goals and pursuing them. We are also producers. We don't live flourishing lives by hunting and gathering, but by creating values which we trade with others. Even those who are not productive must rely on the effort of the productive. For example, the mentally ill, the severely disabled, and Marxist university lecturers. We live best as rational, productive beings, but we don't have automatic knowledge. And so we need guidance to help us to choose the values we need. This is where morality comes in. The objectivist ethics give us the universal values and virtues that we as human beings need to flourish. Not the personal values. You have to choose your own personal values, what career you want to pursue, what relationships, or what you want to find in your friends, and your hobbies. But it gives you the fundamental values to help you make these choices. Ayn Rand identified 3 cardinal values: reason, purpose, and self-esteem, and 7 virtues required to achieve and sustain these values. Rationality, for example, If you're a public health official setting the COVID-19 response, keep the context of how many deaths by influenza there are each year and how many people will die from other causes in the proposed lockdown. Evaluate the evidence carefully before acting. Don't let your decisions be driven by fear or public pressure. I followed this guidance completely, right? Nope. So productiveness is the next one. Set achievable goals that will bring you great satisfaction and be persistent when the going gets tough. The embodiment of this was Thomas Edison, who tested 1,600 materials for the filament for the first commercial light bulb. Number 3, integrity, walk the talk. Don't betray your convictions and values under pressure from colleagues and customers. Be like Peter Ridd, standing up to those who tried to censor his disagreement about the reef. Honesty. Don't try to gain a value by faking the facts. I think it's fairly obvious that lying is not in your interests. Reality will always show you up. Lies lead to more lies, and eventually you're tripped up. Independence of thinking. Don't just accept the narrative of climate change on the authority of some scientists, but assess the evidence yourself. Justice. Reward the employee who comes up with a great profit-making idea and get rid of the unproductive employee. And finally, pride, which Ayn Rand called moral ambitiousness. Work to continually improve your character, like Benjamin Franklin, who in his early 20s resolved to live like a rational person, as he called it. He made a list of 13 virtues, which he worked hard to build into his character. Now, I can vouch for these principles. They've helped me immeasurably over 35 years. Ayn Rand advocated that we choose our personal values according to the standard of a rational, productive being. A career that can bring us fulfillment and enjoyment personally, and relationships and hobbies in order to achieve our happiness. Evil, the bad, is defined as that which acts against this standard. And since we live by reason, evil action against us specifically is that which prevents us from acting on our knowledge and towards our goals. In summary then, in direct opposition to altruism, morality is selfish. It is guiding us to act according to what is objectively in our interest, to choose the actions that will sustain our own lives and attain happiness. So just quickly, a quick summary. The first thing I saw from Ayn Rand was that was the principled entrepreneur as a moral, even heroic figure. Secondly, that you could ground morality in the facts of reality and they could be a great guide to life. Thirdly, in the light of all this, I began to see that altruism made no sense, and also that it was just destructive, not only to the able, but also to the needy, as Ayn Rand shows very well in the description of the communist experiment, run by the heirs of the 20th century motor company in Atlas Shrugged. It's a vivid and compelling picture of the destructiveness of the so-called noble ideal. And fourthly, I saw how individual rights flowed naturally from rational egoism. And that's not an accident, because the founding fathers were heavily influenced by John Locke, who was heavily influenced by the ancient Greeks, particularly Aristotle. And the founding fathers themselves were, it seems, very well read in terms of Aristotle. So they depend on the ideas that I've been talking about, and they can't survive without them, as the history of the United States has shown. Everything was fine during the 19th century until the intellectuals from American universities went over to Europe to study and were heavily influenced by Kantian philosophy. And they brought that back, and then we started to get all the problems, antitrust legislation, and more controls on business and more welfare. So the complete violation of rights. Their proper justification, rights that is, their proper justification is that in order to live a flourishing life in society, we must be free to act on our own judgment. Rationality is of no use if we're prevented from applying it to our lives, hence the right to liberty. Productiveness is of no use if we can't use and dispose of what we produced, hence the right to property. And it makes no sense to speak of happiness being the moral purpose of your life if you can't choose to act for what will bring you happiness. If, for example, the government heavily regulates your career, hence the pursuit of happiness. So this is what I found in Ayn Rand's writings that profoundly changed my evaluation of capitalism. The view of a principled entrepreneur as a moral figure and a justifiably selfish one. The realization that morality can be grounded in the facts of reality and be a very useful guide to life. And the understanding that individual rights flow naturally from a morality of rational self-interest. So to sum up what I've been saying tonight, why I believe Ayn Rand's philosophy is critical to liberty. The main impediment to the advancement of liberty is the morality of altruism. Most believe this confers a right to be looked after and that governments should compel others to fulfill their obligations. Ayn Rand has shown us how to refute altruism by explaining why we need morality and showing that altruism fails in this requirement as it provides no guidance on how to achieve a flourishing life. While life requires us to pursue values, to obtain values, altruism says, give it up, give them away. In contrast, Ayn Rand has identified the values and virtues required by our nature as rational, productive beings. And finally, the objectivist ethics enable us to demonstrate that laissez-faire capitalism is the only moral social system, because by banning the initiation of physical force, it protects our rights to live morally, that is, as rational, productive beings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nigel. That was excellent. I'm just going to allow participants to unmute themselves if they want to ask any questions in person. I think we might have one or two in the chat as well. So if you wanted to take a look at those, that might be a place to start. Though I do have to ask before that, is Elon Musk going to build Gulp's Gulch on Mars?
That's a good question, is he? Is that what he's planning?
I'm not sure, but it's certainly been speculated in a couple of places that I've seen as the next frontier for productivity.
Oh, okay. Can't say I'd be all that keen.
What's your take on Musk?
On what, sorry? On Mars?
Yes.
Oh, well, I haven't really thought much about it, actually. I mean,
would you say he fits?
Pretty amazing to see such an achievement again, isn't it? Or not again, but to actually, well, to see him launching that rocket space station privately.
Yeah, he's certainly someone uncompromising in terms of the work he wants to achieve, which leads some to believe he might have objectivist tendencies.
Yeah, well, I've not really heard of anything like that about him. Have you, Decky?
I haven't either, but from my understanding, a lot of people in Silicon Valley, like they are aware of Ayn Rand and her writings, and they do have like a sense of admiration or respect for her. But when they're sort of put against the wall, they'll downplay her influence. I mean, it's possible that he does because he's friends with Peter Thiel, and I know Peter Thiel is influenced by her.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question here from Davo. Are you stating that altruism is somehow synonymous to utilitarianism? I think there are elements in common for sure. In fact, utilitarianism, I think, is the greatest good of the greatest number. So there would be an implied sacrifice there by the smallest number, wouldn't there? But altruism is much more extreme than that. I mean, it's really saying to everybody that you need to sacrifice, that anything done for your own benefit is outside the province of morality. So it's much more crazy. I see you've answered that, Decky, already. I'm not entirely familiar with utilitarians. If an individual is acting in an altruistic way, whereby they sacrifice something of value for a lesser value, then that's immoral. Yes, agree. Same applies to the state. If they're seeking to sacrifice us, citizens, for their ends, then that's also immoral. One example is the climate change debate, where we're required to sacrifice better forms of energy generation for lesser ones, such as green energy. Yes, true. What's your opinion, from Jason, what's your opinion on the Australian media's coverage of the riots in the US right now? Sorry, Jason, I can't really give you a very good opinion on that. I haven't been paying a lot of attention to the Australian media. I assume that it's been just a little bit slanted, because why would it be? It never is, but maybe in this case it is. No, I assume that it's not covering things properly, and it's blaming, or at least it's maybe not failing to draw attention to the role of groups like Antifa. Yeah, anybody else got questions?
Yeah, I found the point of the objectivism really interesting, that altruism is the problem, and like how anti-altruism is the most moral way to live. I found, does that mean that you believe that altruism itself is immoral? It's immoral to be altruistic?
I do, yeah, I do in that sense. Self-sacrifice certainly is immoral, because I define morality as a set of principles aiding you in advancing your life, in achieving a flourishing life. That is why we need morality. So how can something which tells you to sacrifice be part of a morality? And it's actually inimical to human life.
Wouldn't that be defining morality as the best possible way to live? Because for me, doing something immoral is different to doing the best possible thing.
That's right. I mean, that's a fair comment, and that's exactly how we've been brought up. That you know, the moral and the practical are opposed, and that to help your life, to aid your life, you need to be, in a traditional sense, immoral, and that yeah, as I said, the moral and the practical are at opposite ends of the spectrum. So yeah, we have these ideas about what is good and what is moral, and they come from altruism. They come from this notion that selflessness is good. But in fact, that completely ignores the real function of morality.
What do you mean by the real function of morality?
Well, that you need morality for life. This is what Ayn Rand clearly shows in the Objectivist Ethics. I didn't really have time to go through it tonight. It's quite difficult to explain, but what she's pointing out there is that the concept of value only comes into effect because life requires us to pursue values. So it makes no sense to say that a morality can be a set of values that, or can be geared towards self-sacrifice. And you can see that it's been heavily used in the past as a means of gaining power and control.
Interesting. So that's different for me, is because you've got morality as, that assumption that you said before is that you have to have a value or an aim in life to be able to live, and that's related to morality. Whereas for me, when I've considered morality, I believe that's not doing certain things. So like for my own personal principles, that would be not harming or restricting others and not supporting the harm or restriction of others. And for me, that's more of the point of morality, right? This is the opposite end, which is focusing on towards the best possible way to live, being the definition of morality. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct. But I mean, it does imply that if you believe that morality is about achieving a flourishing life, as soon as you start to bring in other people, then you need to realize that applies to them as well. So it's an implication that you cannot violate their rights. You cannot stop them from doing what they need to do to achieve their flourishing life. And you certainly can't harm them. I've got a question here from Davo's. Yeah, Davo's got one. So taking a bullet for another human being is somehow immoral. Look, I mean, it depends on the context. It could be something that you'd want to do purely because you couldn't live without that other person. If it was your wife or your child, and you couldn't bear the thought of them dying and living without them, then you would do that, wouldn't you? Kelly, human suffering. What about one is suffering and their efficacy is lost and need help or assistance from another person? How does she address such problems? She says, Ayn Rand says that this sort of concern is really outside the province of morality. It's only a minor virtue, but you know, and if you want to help other people who are in trouble through no fault of their own, or if they're unable to provide for themselves, then fine, go ahead, but don't sacrifice important values. Don't give away all your wealth, and do what you can do to afford to help if you'd like to do that. From Madeline, does the philosophy of altruism have any roots with the church? I think it is strongly derived from Christianity, and I think Kant was drawing a lot on Christianity when he was promoting his views on altruism. There is a difference, but there is the self-sacrifice, the exhortation to be selfless is certainly common to both, very much so. And in fact, Immanuel Kant said that he said that I have set out to destroy reason to make way for faith. So that's another area of philosophy, but he was very destructive in that sense as well. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with the source and nature of knowledge. And Immanuel Kant has been extremely destructive in that sense. But you can see that there's a motivation there. He didn't like what he saw in the age of reason, the Enlightenment. He didn't like the fact that individualism was being promoted by the founding fathers. Actually, I think I've got my timelines wrong there, haven't I? Becky, do you know when Kant was around? Was it mid
1700s.
Sorry?
I think it was 1700s.
Yeah, it was 1700s, because it was at the latter part of the 18th century or the earlier. But anyway, he could see that John Locke, for example, was having an influence and promoting individualism, and Aristotle's ideas were coming to the fore again. Aristotle was a rational egoist also. So, yes, Kant was pretty keen to destroy reason for that reason, to make way for faith. So you can see that he was again very heavily influenced by religion there, I think. Kimberly from Richard. Kant was responsible ultimately for postmodernism because he could not reconcile empirical method with his religious beliefs. Yes, I do agree with you that he was very much responsible for postmodernism. Postmodernism is really very much the result of Kant's philosophy. I'm not sure what you mean by reconcile empirical method with his religious beliefs.
Well, rational thinking and objectivity, he couldn't accept it.
Yes, well, this is what I was saying before, that he actually...
Yeah, you were saying exactly what I meant.
Yeah, I've set out to destroy reason to make way for faith. Altruism encourages being a burden on others. Self-respect for each individual is that they can provide for themselves and not be a burden on others. Exactly, yes. Altruism does promote that. And if you live by a proper rational morality, then you maximize your ability to survive by your own effort. Okay, so that's all we have in the chat.
If I might trouble you with one more general question. Often libertarianism and objectivism get lumped together by, I guess, people who aren't particularly familiar with either philosophy. But there certainly do seem to be some key differences between the two, and some very valuable crossover. What, in your view, would be the most significant differences between objectivism and libertarianism, and what could libertarianism and libertarians learn from objectivism that might improve their lives and their efforts?
Yeah, good question, Big. So I think I take libertarianism to mean that to really start with the non-aggression principle. So I think that libertarianism is starting in politics. Philosophy consists of 5 branches. Metaphysics, which is to do with the study of what really exists and is it possible to, well, that's more epistemology, but essentially, does existence exist first, or does consciousness create existence? So we talk about issues of God and all of that as well. So that's metaphysics. Epistemology, as I've said, the study of knowledge and the nature and source of knowledge. And then ethics, and then politics. So ethics very much depends on metaphysics and on epistemology. If you believe that reason is efficacious, that you can know reality, then you will have a very different ethics than if you believe that knowledge only comes from revelation, for example. And politics, as I said before, rests on ethics. So libertarianism starts with politics. It starts with the non-aggression principle, as I said before, which means that it can subsume in its fold many different belief systems. And to me, this is a problem, because to me, the only way you can properly defend freedom and liberty, as I've tried to make clear tonight, is with a rational ethics of self-interest. That's the only way I believe you can do it. You cannot argue for liberty, the right to live your life, and the right to pursue happiness on any other ethical basis. And so I think it's really important that people understand that, and that's what Ayn Rand has to show, to teach us. Ayn Rand is a really, really big deal. She has made amazing, enormous discoveries in all those branches of philosophy. And really everybody should take heed of what she said and see that it will help them advance the cause of liberty.
Thank you so much.
Answer the question?
It certainly does. So thanks very much for that answer and for your talk tonight. It was
You're very welcome.
Very instructive to myself, and I hope to everyone else here. Can we please have a big hand of applause for Nigel?
Thank you.
That was great.
Do an applause.
Virtual meetings. All right. That was very good. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
question.